So good morning, everybody. Lovely to see so many of you online. Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to Adoption UK. We have a fantastic webinar coming up from Becky, Mary and Gemma. Really grateful for your time today, ladies. If anybody's got any questions, we can't see you and we can't hear you, so it doesn't matter what chaos is going on behind. Do not worry. And the way for you to ask any questions or interact is by using the chat facility. So at the end, I will come back and any questions you've got, I shall ask to the three hosts. If you can just put down roughly where you are, so it's really helpful for the answers, whether they know that you're Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland or England, because there is very different education guidance from the nations. So thank you so much, and I shall hand over.
Well, thank you, Claire, and good morning, everybody, and thank you for giving up your time this morning to come and talk to us about transitions back to school. We're going to be talking particularly about care experienced children and young people, and why transitions can be difficult for those young people and children, and why this transition will be particularly difficult. I'm going to share a few slides with you. We're going to talk through some theoretical background, and then I'm going to bring in our experts, Gemma and Mary, who will introduce more fully later, to talk to you, to answer your questions and to talk to you in more specific detail. I'm going to share the screen with you now. We've got a few slides just to get going. Someone's asking if anyone's having audio issues. We have had some difficulties with our internet connection this morning. I hugely apologise if you find it difficult to hear us. Nonetheless, the recording should be unaffected by that, and hopefully, I'm hoping it will be, and hopefully will be available tomorrow for you to look at. Now, I'm going to run through this in a huge amount of speed, because actually I could easily deliver a half-day training on transitions. And in fact, Adoption UK, if you're a member, education member of Adoption UK, we do have a downloadable PowerPoint with notes designed for teachers to use within their education settings. So this is a benefit that's available to members. It's not the only one, with a few of those, but we do have one on transitions and change. And so that's part of the education membership package, and we're just currently working on adapting that to make it COVID specific. So if you're here on this webinar today, but you're thinking about whether you're going to want to provide some in-service training in your setting before your young people come back in August or September, depending on where you are, then we will have that available for Adoption UK members. Obviously, the recording of this webinar will be available for anyone to use, so you can feel free to go ahead and use that in your setting. I'm saying planning a smooth return to education after COVID-19 is the title of the slide. I'm going to admit straight away that that might be optimistic, and there's so much that's uncertain that we don't know. And that's part of the problem when we're talking about transitions. So why are transitions so difficult or tricky for care experienced and adopted young people? Well, there are a number of reasons. I'm going to whip through them at lightning speed, but I wanted to lay this groundwork because it gives us context within which to discuss the challenges we all might be facing going ahead. One of the reasons is that all care experienced young people have been through really severe transitions before. I used to be a short-term and emergency foster carer, and children would come to me sometimes from the police station, sometimes from the hospital, late at night, separated from family, separated from siblings. Children who've been through care experience have experienced really traumatic transitions, often several times. And so transitions can trigger conscious or subconscious memories of these dramatic past transitions. Transitions have been a difficult place to be for care experienced and adopted young people. A lot of children who've experienced lack of safety and a lot of things happening to them that they were out of control of have a strong desire to be in control, partly because they've come to understand or come to believe that they must rely on themselves for their own safety and their own well-being. They may not have the strong attachment relationships with adults that enable them to trust and rely on adults, and so they feel the need to rely on themselves. And so when they feel like they're losing control or they have no control over what's happening, this can cause particular difficulties. And this can be a problem in transitions. Often transitions are outside of the control of the young people who are doing the transition. They take place at times decided by others and in a format decided by others. So sometimes young people will struggle with transitions because it takes away the element of control for them. They feel all at sea and they don't really trust that the adults around them are going to be able to keep them safe in the way that they want to be kept safe. The third one on this slide I'm is about environmental triggers. Now, this can be a significant feature on the small transitions that take place daily in schools. If you think about the transition from a fairly quiet, orderly classroom to a kind of more chaotic, running about playground, there are environmental triggers in that. A lot of these are sensory triggers, the noise, the hustle and bustle, the movement. Some of them can be related to changing of your state from calm and quiet to boisterous and running about, or vice versa, and it can be difficult to transition from one stage to the next. Now, in terms of larger scale transitions to school holidays or from one year group to another, these are also associated with change of the seasons or times of year, and so these external triggers can add on to make transitions more difficult. If you think about moving to the summer holidays, the weather changes, some schools change the uniform. There are a lot of signs that go on that move towards a transition. Some of these can have triggering effects on children who have conscious or subconscious memories of transitions in the past. Think about being led away from your family home down a footpath covered in snow and the snow crunching under your feet and the feeling of the cold air in your nose. These can be almost subconscious sensory memories that children have that can be reignited when that season comes round again. So some of our school transitions are linked to these seasonal changes that can also be linked to previous difficult transitions. I'm rattling through, I'm sorry for the speed. Separation anxiety is another factor in transition, especially if we think about children returning to school after the holidays or coming into school in the morning. And now separation anxiety, it's a completely normal stage of development, but in some children who have experienced disrupted attachment or adverse childhood experiences, this can continue beyond when we might have expected it to stop. So separation anxiety is not an unusual thing to come across in children who are older than you might expect to find it occurring in. When we transition from one state to another or one task to another, we're using executive functioning skills. So for children with delayed or less developed executive functioning skills, transition can be difficult then. And inflexible thinking can be an issue. Now, I don't know about you, but I suffer hugely from inflexible thinking. In that sense, if I am focused on the thing I am doing, I find it incredibly difficult to just stop that thing and start doing another thing. I can't shift my focus away from the thing I'm engaged in right now. And so I will resist transitioning to a new activity because I'm incredibly focused on what I'm doing now, and I can't seem to find a part of my brain to think about the thing I'm going to do next. So the thing that's coming next is a black hole to me, and I don't want to go there and do it. This, I think, is incredibly common actually amongst adults and children and young people. So the skills that we need to plan a transition and to move ourselves from one state to another, they're not necessarily always fully developed in children or adults, and some will need extra support with this. I've mentioned difficulties regulating the internal state. I spoke earlier about children perhaps coming in from a busy, noisy playground and then expected to sit calmly and quietly in a quiet classroom. Well, it's not always that easy to change your internal state from one of excitement and running and activity to one of stillness and calmness and quietness. When we're looking to do that kind of transition, we would consider putting in like a transition activity, something between one state and the next that's kind of neutral and in between, that allows children to change their internal state in stages. So we're not asking them to move from one kind of activity level to another kind of activity level. In terms of children returning after COVID-19, I don't know what your children have experienced, but my children have certainly experienced day after day after day in the house, sitting around, doing less physical activity than usual, spending much less time interacting socially with other people than usual. And we're asking them, when they return to school, to move from that environment to, albeit a less busy than usual school environment with probably children in smaller groups, but still quite a different environment. And so this will be a big transition for children. And the final one I'm mentioning there is fear. Fear and anxiety can be an enormous factor. And sometimes that fear it's not possible for the child to articulate what they are afraid of. It is a general sense of being afraid. It is a general sense of expecting danger. It is a general sense of being hypervigilant or feeling anxious. And this can put up roadblocks all along the way when you're asking children to transition from the thing that they know because they're doing it now to a thing that they don't really know because they're not doing it yet. And so fear of losing control, fear of, I'm thinking of children who strongly fear not having finished the work that they're doing, that becomes a big issue for them. You ask them to transition to a new thing, but they've not finished the thing they're doing, and they're all panicking about it. So fear is a massive underlying factor in making transitions difficult. And this is just in the normal course of things. Some of the reasons why transitions can be particularly difficult for care experienced children. But what we're experiencing now is not the normal course of things. COVID-19 has been an unprecedented situation for everybody, and we're all experiencing a lifestyle that is not what we are used to at all. I think this transition will be harder, and one of the reasons it will be harder is because there wasn't a good ending to what went before. So actually schools work quite hard to manage transitions. If you think about the transition from, say, the end of primary school or the end of nursery school to the next setting that a child will go to, there's a huge amount of planning goes into that. There will be visits and there'll be meetings and there'll be information shared. And not only that, but schools and settings will work hard to provide a good ending for the child's time in that setting. There'll be time to say goodbye to children and staff members. There might be a celebration event. There might be books with photographs in. There may be opportunity to create displays to commemorate the time that children have spent in the school. There wasn't time or the possibility for any of that to take place when schools closed pretty rapidly as we went into lockdown. So it wasn't a good ending for young people. They weren't prepared for this transition and they were thrust into it. So it sets up all of the things we talked about earlier in the previous two slides, the anxiety and the difficulty changing state and the executive functioning. All of that has been blown out of the water. This transition took place at a time of heightened anxiety for everybody, personally, in people's families and nationally. Even young children are able to pick up on the anxiety that's being played out in the news, on the news stories that are happening, on daily reports of the number of people that have died of COVID-19, of all of this stuff that's going on around them. Children may have experienced loss, or they may have experienced the fear of loss. And this has been going on throughout all of that time. So we know that there will be children returning who have experienced poverty or increased levels of poverty, loss of family income, sickness, self-isolation, serious concerns about family members with medical conditions that are in the extremely clinically vulnerable group, bereavement, and the list goes on. This has been a national trauma for a lot of children. All of this with care experienced children and young people is adding on to a pretty heavy bucket of trauma they were already carrying around. Children will have concerns around safety. Now, when we've talked about children who've experienced neglect and abuse, they can already be very concerned about safety, their own safety and other people's safety, and following the rules and being a strong sense of justice around that. I have a 9-year-old who has extremely strong sense of safety and extremely heightened appreciation of following the rules. We had further down our street a VE Day celebration. There was a street party took place on our street, and he was horrified by it because he felt that people weren't following the rules and he felt that people weren't being safe. Now, I spent years trying to encourage my adopted child to feel safer and to understand the ways in which he's safe and the ways in which I'm working to keep him safe. But what we've created now is a scenario where things that used to be safe are now no longer safe. You can't touch people, you can't stand close to people, you can't, there is risk everywhere, really. And so for children who are already hypervigilant about danger, we've created a whole new set of dangers for them to be concerned about. And now we're asking them to leave their homes and go back into schools with quite a lot of other children and adults. And there's going to be concerns around safety, and there's going to be hypervigilance, and there's going to be fear. Another reason why this transition has been difficult is because of the routines. We really recommend having a strong and robust routine around any transition that's going to take place. That hasn't been possible. Not only was there no sensible routine around the ending of school, but when children came home after schools closed, they didn't come home to a home that was in its normal routine. It was lockdown, so visits to family and friends were not possible. The usual extracurricular activities have not been happening. We haven't been able to live our life in a normal way. So there's been a big amount of changes of routine, not only in school for those who've been able to attend, but also at home. Everything's been different. And this has been an extended period of uncertainty. I find with my children that if we're experiencing some change, if I can put an end point on it and show them what we're working towards, that helps them to understand that and work towards that. And it gives them a sense of an anchor point to hold on to when things seem a little bit different and unusual. This would apply, for instance, when we go on holiday. Sometimes going on holiday can be quite challenging, but they know that there's an end point to it, and after that we'll go home, and we can count down the days to when that will be, so they feel some control of what's going on. But with this change, there's been no known end time, and in fact the end date of it in some cases has been shifted and moved, which creates even more uncertainty and makes it more difficult for children to anchor themselves in what's going on. We surveyed just under 700 people from Adoption UK. This was just under 700 families with adopted or care experienced young people at home. So this included foster carers and special guardians as well. And what we found was a really mixed bag in terms of what children were experiencing as a result of lockdown. And the main thing I want to emphasize, I'm not going to read all the statistics to you, but the main thing I want to emphasize is there is no one experience of lockdown. You will know that already. You will know from speaking to people that you know that different people are experiencing this time in different ways. And that is just as true as of care experienced children and young people as it is of anybody else. So we did find that in some families there was significant challenges taking place during lockdown, as you can see with those statistics there on that slide. But we also found that some families were really reaping positive benefits of lockdown. And I think both of these have implications on what children's needs will be when they get ready to return to school. We might be relieved to see that 39% of children seem calmer without the stress caused by school. In fact, among secondary age children, more than 50% of parents said their secondary age child seemed calmer at home than they do when they're at school, which is lovely. It's nice that children seem calmer and less stressed, but obviously then that has implications for how willing and able those children will be to return to school when the time happens. More than half of parents said that, in fact I think it was more than 60% of parents said they thought their child would need extra support on returning to school, and more than 40% said they were worried that their child might refuse to attend, and would be a real struggle to get them to go back. One parent or carer spoke movingly about how her son just couldn't leave the house, was too afraid to leave the house, and she had no idea how she was going to attempt to get him back to school when the time came. So when we look to think about how transition is going to look, these are the things we want to be taken into account. We know that some of our children have needs that are already known to us, but we cannot assume that their needs now will be the same as they were 3 or 4 months ago. Some things may have improved, some things may have gone downhill, and we're going to have to take it as it comes. So we need to know about the child's previously known needs, but we also need to know what is the new normal for the child. What has the child been experiencing? What is their current status? And to do that, we need to understand their experiences of lockdown. So a lot of schools now are beginning to try to gather that information from families, in some cases focusing on children who they think will struggle the most, although I don't suspect we know who those children always are, but to try to understand what children's experiences of lockdown have been, what they've found has gone well and what they've struggled with, and what their worries and concerns are about coming back to school. And we also need to take into account the new normal in the setting. We're not bringing children back after a long summer holiday to a school that they're familiar with, in a setting, in a structure that they're familiar with. They haven't been on holiday, nobody's been to the beach. Well, some people have been to the beach, let's be fair, but they haven't been sunning themselves on the beach, relaxing and having a lovely time during this last 12 to 14 weeks. That isn't what has been happening. And when they return to school, they will not be returning to school as they know it. And all of that will impact on the way that we transition them. Now, yesterday, Gemma and Mary and I had a chat, and we tried to come up with a list of what we were going to call key considerations. Because we really felt it was important for schools and educators to be able to take away some kind of practical things that were easily rememberable. And so I'm going to bring Gemma in at this point, and Mary. Gemma, would you just take a moment to introduce yourself, please?
Hi everyone, my name is Gemma Burns and I'm a consultant clinical psychologist, and I work in Wales, so I'm talking from a Welsh perspective, but I'm mindful of kind of the English context and also the Northern Ireland context. In terms of my roles within the NHS, I lead a psychology service working with adoption children, and I'm also a lead for a whole school approach to emotional wellbeing within the region that I work in.
Thank you, Gemma. Mary, could you just chip in as well?
Yeah, sure. Morning, everyone. I'm sorry I can't see you. Yeah, I'm Meredith. I worked in secondary schools for about 25 years, teaching English and then moving on to being Senko and then leading behaviour. Always been very interested in inclusion and the children who sort of marginalised within the system. And so when an opportunity came up at Lincolnshire to lead inclusion across the county, I went for that, and I've been doing that for the last 4 years. Reading a lot about trauma actually in that time, because I think a pattern that you don't necessarily see at school level is the link between trauma and exclusion. But when you have caseworkers working with families of excluded children, and you get to know their histories, that pattern is just so clear and so sad, really. So in an endeavour to reduce exclusion across Lincolnshire, we decided what we needed to do was become trauma informed, so that those children who'd suffered all sorts of bereavements and losses and who ended up in the PRU had a better chance in their schools. And so that's the current focus, really, and obviously very relevant at the moment.
Completely. People are talking about trauma now like never before. I didn't introduce myself earlier because I forgot. Yeah, obviously I'm Becky Brooks. I currently am Adoption UK's Education Policy Advisor. I'm also a former foster carer and adoptive parent. And prior to that, I was a secondary school teacher for quite a lot of years. And I think I would probably say that my interest in experiences of care experience and adopted young children actually began to spark during 2 years I spent living and working in Romania amongst Romania's what they call abandoned children. I mean, we would call them orphanages, they're not really orphanages, but that was a crash course in attachment and trauma, if anything. And so that's where I'm coming to this from. So we came up with these key considerations. So I'm just going to pop through them one by one. Some of them are very self-explanatory. We're going to try and get this done, Claire, by 11:35, optimistically, because I suspect that I've seen the chat thing flashing, and I suspect there are quite a few questions coming up, and I want to give time for people's questions. So we're really going to rattle through this as well. But the first one is about staff wellbeing. Now, I think this cannot be emphasised enough. I have had conversations with teachers and education professionals, both on social media and in real life. And what I'm sensing from some people is an enormous sense of anxiety about going back. Some of that's related to everything that's gone on over the past few months, which has been unprecedented and difficult and hard to manage. But some of it's also related to the safety and how things will be managed going forward. And I think what concerns me at this time is that we have a workforce who is already stressed out to the max, trying to provide education to children in a way that's had never been done before on this level. And now, of course, in many cases, certainly in England and soon, I think, in Wales, returning to education with children in school, but also children at home that need an online programme still delivering. So I don't know, for me, that looks like a doubled workload. And with all kinds of anxiety around their own health and their own well-being. And the truth is that if a school is filled with anxious, unsupported, stressed out staff members, then those staff members are not able to regulate the emotional temperature of their classrooms. We need to take care of our staff well-being, or else staff will be entering classrooms stressed and responding out of a place of stress to things that go on. And that's not going to bring the stress levels down in the children. And I wondered, Mary, if you had anything you wanted to offer on this.
Yeah, I think 3 points really. The first one, the importance of leadership. Gemma's lucky in that she's speaking from Wales, and there's been a really strong focus on wellbeing, and almost leaders have got a mandate to prioritise that. But in England, you know, the agenda is very much around catch-up, academic catch-up, and when there's reference to wellbeing, there seems to be an assumption that actually we just get the children back into school and then wellbeing will take care of itself. And for all the reasons that you've outlined in that detailed introduction, we know that that's not the case. So I think leaders have to be strong enough to buffer their staff against this national agenda, and to recognise that actually it's counterproductive anyway. You know, we know all about the impact of stress on our capacity to learn. That applies to children just as to adults. So if we don't think about emotional regulation and supporting staff to look after themselves, then it's not going to be productive. So it's about leaders prioritising wellbeing and mandating teachers to do that, and not chasing progress data and catch-up data immediately. That will come, and it will be better actually if the transition is managed properly. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is around the sense of belonging for staff as well. We know that children need a sense of belonging to thrive in schools, but there's lots of research that shows that actually staff are also more productive in the workplace if they feel a sense of belonging there, if going to school feels a bit like joining your family, you know, an extended family. Not all schools feel like that, but I think that needs to be a focus. And actually, you know, what's in place now to keep staff connected with each other? Are leaders thinking about that? You know, we're encouraging leaders to use surveys to find out about wellbeing issues amongst pupils, but are they doing the same for their staff? You know, is anybody really struggling, and are we reaching out to that person now, you know, before they're back in school full time? Because we really should be. So it's about creating that sense of belonging for staff, having fun together, going back to an atmosphere that feels light and playful is important. And then I think finally, for me particularly, giving staff a sense of control. So to thrive, we need to feel a sense of agency, not feel done to, not feel subject to top-down diktats, if you like. We've all sort of been subject to those from, I suppose, the government itself, you know, through lockdown measures, and it's difficult to cope with. As we go back to school, it's a new journey for all of us. We've never been here before, so leaders will probably make mistakes. We'll all make mistakes. And to navigate those, it's going to be really important to sort of sense check how things are going. You know, have we got the balance of blended learning and classroom learning right? Are we asking too much of you? Have you got any ideas? And having that conversation with staff the whole way through, I think is probably the most important thing that leaders can do for wellbeing. Much more important than the yoga on a Friday night after school, I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, I must admit, most of the things that are advertised as being for self-care are not for me. I don't enjoy taking a really long bath, but when I think if I'm struggling with stress because of my workload, what I need is a reduced workload, and that would probably really help with my stress. We've mentioned on the second one that well-being is foundational to children's learning, so there's loads of support, of research support for the idea that when children are in a feeling safe and emotionally and physically in a good state, then they're much more able to learn and to make progress and to do well. Gemma, I wondered if you had anything you wanted to add about staff or student well-being.
Yeah, I think just to kind of just to echo Mary's point, previous to the lockdown in Gwent in Wales, one of the things that we did was that we spent a lot of time with staff and families and young people, asking them that question really: what makes a difference to your well-being in your school community? What are the things that make a difference? And what we heard resoundingly really was those themes around safety. I need to feel safe. I need to know what to expect. I need to know that people are kind of looking out for me, both for staff and families and pupils. It applies to all. That sense of belonging. I need to know that actually I'm part of a community that's got my best interests at heart, that I've got a shared identity. Agency, you know, that I've got a voice, people listen to me, that actually I've got a role in kind of shaping what my community looks like. And efficacy, you know, I'm successful, I can be successful, that what I contribute and what I can achieve has value here. And really those themes are kind of so universal around across all of those kind of groups. I suppose the other thing to say that we heard loud and clear is that well-being is often the little things that people do. It's the small moments of connection. It's the importance of the relationship. It's, you know, very few people said to us, do you know what? It was that brilliant tool that the school brought in that really helped me with my well-being. No, the things that people said is, it was my teacher remembering that I'm having a tricky time at the moment. It was my manager checking in with me how my mum was because she's been really poorly recently. It's the sense of I'm held in mind. and people care for me and I care for others, and really thinking about how you create communities where we can both feel empathy and express empathy for others, which feels kind of so critical and, you know, such an important focus for us now.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and that's a really important point, that much of what we will all need, adults and children going forward, is not about fancy programs or expensive interventions or about diagnosing people with things, because actually to respond in some way to an abnormal situation is kind of normal. It's normal to have a response to an abnormal situation. There's nothing strange about that. We need to be accepting of that. But the much of where the restoration of well-being or what we talk about will come in, will be in the relationships that we have with the people that we're spending time with, and it will be in the moments of connection. And I think later on I'm going to bring you back in, Gemma, to talk about something you mentioned about communication, but I'm going to rattle through the next three things because it's already 11:35. But I'm going to rattle through them because they're quite practical and fairly straightforward. So the third one was the massive importance of communicating with families around the new normal. Actually, Mary shared on Twitter this morning a video of alternative provision. Is it close to you?
Yeah,
It was
I loved it.
Show.
It's not close to me, no.
It was a lovely video, and it just had a bit of humour in it and a bit of joking around, but it got the message across really clearly about what was going to be expected. 4 or 5 simple expectations laid out in print, said out loud, demonstrated on video in quite amusing, light-hearted ways, really, that really took the edge off the anxiety about coming back, and gave, importantly, students a visual understanding of the setting that they would be walking into. So communicating about the new normal, reminding families of the things that are going to be familiar so that they can support their children with thinking about familiar activities that they will return to. Because for transition, it helps if you can anchor it in things you did in the past, things that are happening now, and things that will be going on in the future. And when communicating with families, it's really wonderful if you can say, I don't know, something like, dear Jimmy, I'm really missing you at nursery. Do you remember in January when we made those wonderful snowmen in the playground or whatever? I'm really looking forward to seeing you back at nursery in whenever, so that we can read a reading book together in the reading corner, or something like that. So you're bringing to children memories of familiar things that they've done, and showing them how that some of that familiarity will be retained, but at the same time being able to demonstrate the things that will be different, and to do that in a way that takes down the threat and the fear around it. So that was that. Start with curiosity. We mentioned earlier on, you can't assume anything about what children have experienced during lockdown. So if you were able to gather information from parents and carers and from young people themselves where appropriate, this will be extremely helpful in terms of planning what you're going to be doing. And this could be an online form or a survey or a postcard they fill in, or there's a number of different ways of doing that. You'll have to choose what's best for your setting. And the third thing was to do with agency that Gemma was talking about, that if we can involve children in planning, if we can explain to children what is needed and get their suggestions. Well, we'd love to play some playground games, but we can't stand too close to each other. What games do you think we could play where we don't have to stand too close to each other? Ooh, Simon Says, brilliant. Yes, we can all play Simon Says and nobody has to, all right? Or, well, we can't really touch each other as much as we used to. How can we say hello to each other without touching each other? How can we show someone that we care about them without touching each other? There's been a lovely, or someone might have to tell me what it's called. There's been a lovely a story being written. They've made a video version of it, and it's a hedgehog, I think. It's Ewan McLaughlin, someone like that. It's a hedgehog, and it's just a conversation between a hedgehog and I think it's a tortoise or a turtle, showing all the different ways that you can express your emotions or express hello or different feelings to each other without touching one another. I do have it on a slide on this PowerPoint later on, so I'll scroll down and find it. And then this idea of breaking big steps down into small steps. So this could be on a macro level. So it might be about, we don't think this child will be able to return to school full time right now. Let's look at how we can break that big step down into small steps. Or it could be on a micro level. We can't do this individual activity right now. How can we break this individual activity down into small steps? Or we need to all go to wash our hands, but like there's a lot of new rules around that now. How can we break it down into small steps? So just making things manageable. Now, Gemma had mentioned this interesting thought yesterday about making implicit communication explicit to children. And Gemma, I wonder if you could share your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's just really based on what we know from clinical practice, but also from research, that particularly children that have experienced early trauma really struggle to translate people's facial expressions. So often, you know, there was a quite famous piece of research done with children that had experienced domestic violence in the home, and they were shown kind of neutral faces, angry faces, and happy faces. And what they learned was that actually children who had experienced this trauma, their threat areas of their brains fired as much for neutral faces as they did for angry faces. And what we understand by that is that actually, because children that have experienced kind of that early trauma in their most intimate relationships, they perceive threat in lots of different places, and often where maybe there isn't threat, but there's kind of a neutral or ambiguous cues. So one of the things that we were chatting about yesterday was really how important it is for children with early developmental trauma to be very explicit about our intent, to not assume that people will be able to understand what's going on inside our internal world just by the faces that we're making. So very often what we would do is encourage teachers and parents to kind of talk out what they're feeling inside. So, oh sweetheart, you've fallen over, oh you're looking really sad, or you've had a really tricky time, oh my gosh, I'm feeling like I really want to give you a cuddle right now, or you know, oh this is my thinking face, and really kind of very explicitly labeling what is going on in terms of your facial expressions, because often what we do as adults is we supplement our facial expressions with touch and contact, and you know, our touch and our contact is going to be much more reduced now. So it's just about kind of really being aware of kind of what's going on for you, and kind of naming that for a child, so it doesn't leave them in that kind of ambiguous situation where they are more likely to interpret kind of threat or critical judgment from the adults around them.
Great. Yeah, I would never have thought of that. That's absolutely fascinating. Thanks, Gemma. And it's making me have a lot of thoughts about my own children, actually. The final one on the list, I would love to talk about this at great length, but I'm not, because we need to leave time for questions. But I will just say this. I've spoken to a lot of parents. I've number crunched the data on a survey of nearly 700 parents and carers, and I've spoken to people that work in other organisations that have done similar research amongst their cohort of people that they support. And one of the things that has come out really strongly is that for children who've been able to access school at some point during the lockdown because of a key worker or vulnerable child status, that there's been a lot of positive feedback from their experiences at school, that it's been a really incredibly positive time for them. We had parents telling us that it was like their child was getting one-to-one support, they were making remarkable progress, their self-esteem has improved, they had a lot more confidence, they actually were wanting to go to school, whereas previously they didn't really want to go to school. And so all I'm going to say about that, and this is not an immediate goal, but this is more of a medium to long-term goal, is that I would love it if as a whole our education system could learn from what we've seen through these unusual times, both in terms of what children's experiences have been at home and in terms of what children's experiences have been in school. This has been a golden time for some children in school, and a lot of what has happened will not be possible to take forward under our current system, but some of what has happened maybe. And if we can look for ways to embed some of these really positive actions going forward, we may see some children have a more positive experience of school than they've previously had. Okay, I'm going to hang fire there, and I'm going to ask if Claire's able to come in, because I know that we had some questions submitted before today, and I also have seen the chat screen flashing like mad.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you for that information. I'm going to go straight into some of the questions that we've had. So we have a question here. Many care experienced children are disadvantaged in their learning before lockdown and will be further disadvantaged by now. What should schools be asking for to help them support these children back into formal learning?
Yeah.
In there.
So sorry, I'm fiddling with my screen. Yeah, Mary, do you have anything on this? Do you have any thoughts?
Yes, of course, these are the children that we're hearing a lot about from the government, and in terms of catch-up programmes. So, you know, there's a big warning sign that comes with this agenda, which is that we've got to be biologically respectful in the way that we bring them back to formal learning. And if we're not, then we risk all our efforts becoming, you know, very counterproductive. So I find it helpful in lots of things to think around Bruce Perry's 3 R's of regulation, relate, and reason. So these children who found formal learning difficult before lockdown are likely to need to be emotionally regulated in order to access the cortex. We know that really sensitised, hypervigilant, activated children aren't in a place where they can learn. So what can we do within school to ground them, if you like? And I think there we will be drawing on from what happened during lockdown school in terms of physical activities, brain breaks, the daily mile, that kind of thing. And also preparing children. So there's a brilliant resource actually discovered about a week ago from I think the organisation is called Learn for Mental Health, and it's called My Wellbeing Plan. And it's downloadable, it's interactive, and it introduces regulatory activities around 33 and 30. So children practice a wide range of breathing techniques and deep muscle exercises, bilateral tapping activities, that kind of thing, and find out which works for them, because we're all different. So there are 30-second ones that they put into the plan if they work. Then there are 30-minute activities, longer, enjoyable activities that they put into their plan. And then there are 3-minute activities. So by learning about all of these approaches online, they develop a plan that works for them, which they could be doing now, which could easily be shared with school and could become part of the transition plan. So I do recommend that resource, and a real focus on regulation, because children won't learn if they're stressed. Thinking about the classroom environment itself, how can that be regulatory? Thinking about where children sit in the classroom. You know, we often put our children who challenge at the front, where maybe they might feel safe at the back with a wall behind them. So creating an environment which is stress reducing rather than stress inducing. And then we move on to relate. Children can't learn if outside of a safe relationship if they're vulnerable. So again, working on that, making sure that there is a familiar face at school, thinking about the bubble that you put the child in, thinking about that relationship as being absolutely essential, trying to minimise the number of different faces at first. And so once we've got the safety of the relationship and the sense of belonging, then we can think about formal learning. But even then, you know, it's really important to pace that and to listen to the voice of the child as you do that. Because again, Perry talks about novelty as a stressor. Anything new is a stressor. And if we overload the formal learning, there's too much novelty, then it's not going to be accessed. So that this is where things like the brain breaks are really important, which there's good evidence base for actually in terms of improved academic outcomes. If that is the focus, there's lots to say that actually we should give children regular breaks through a lesson. But yeah, too much novelty, too much formal learning too soon isn't going to be helpful, and is likely to therefore, you know, not achieve outcomes.
Thanks, Mary. Sorry, someone just asked, you just cut out. Can you remember the name of the mental health planning resource that you mentioned?
It's called, let me just check. I think it's called My Wellbeing Plan.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I would recommend people to have a look at is some of the Beacon House resources as well.
Yeah.
So they've got some quite nice ideas. I would say what Mary was saying about the importance of regulation and just kind of calming children's brains down, and there's some great resources from Beacon House which might be worth people having a look at.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Right, we've got a question here from England. Local authorities have recently received guidance that they have a duty to make reasonable endeavours to provide the provisions set out in the EHCPs. What does this mean in practice for schools and for parents and carers?
Right, okay, yeah. So, I mean, it's difficult to know exactly what that means in practice, because reasonable endeavours is a vague phrase. that obviously gives no practical support in terms of what might be considered reasonable. But what we talk about here is that in England, there's been some relaxation around what has to be offered in terms of a student's EHCP, because of impossibilities of offering it when children are at home or staff are not available, or all that's been going on. What it will mean is that throughout this time we've been expecting schools to do risk assessments with regards to children with EHCP. That needs to continue, and it needs to take into account that the needs of the child can change. For some children, it may be that it's time to look at an early review of the EHC plan. So as risk assessments are continuing and ongoing, and we can see the situation that children are in and whether their needs have changed significantly, then it might be time for changes there. So everything needs to be kept under review. I think it's not a case of doing a risk assessment and then making a decision and then that's the end of that. And I think the other thing that's really important to say is that there should be no blanket decisions around provision. So reasonable endeavours is not as a whole school or as a whole area, this is what we'll provide to all the children with this, or all the children with an AHP, or all the children in this category. These need to be organised child by according to each individual child's needs and the specific circumstances of them, and there must be co-production. So this must be done with the parents. Some local authorities are asking schools to send in like a reasonable endeavours document stating what they're able to offer and the reasonable endeavours they've taken to fulfil the requirements of the EHCP. But this should be done with the parent and the child. It should be an issue of co-production. The document that the government have released does give some examples of the kind of things that might be done, including even going so far as changing the location of the provision, changing the people that do the provision. But all of this must be agreed and discussed with the young person and the parents themselves, rather than being imposed from above, and it needs to be reasonable. I wondered if, Mary, you had anything particular to offer on that?
I think you've pretty well covered it, really.
Yeah, it's just difficult, really, but I think there will be, I mean, the government document enables, for instance, for conversations to take place about part-time attendance or attendance at a different location or attendance. So these things are kind of possible, but it really must be something that's done in conversation with families and schools, and not letters being sent home saying, oh, we don't think your child will manage, so that you can't bring them in or something like that. Then it needs to be
kept under constant review as well, and with a goal always to getting back full time, and that being regularly reviewed. Yeah, because I think we accept that there are going to be challenges providing everything that's in some children's AHCPs, and that's unavoidable.
Thank you. I've got a question here about a child that may have been shielding, so hasn't been out at all, or children that are unable to attend school. How about keeping them engaged and engaging back with them?
I think it's vital to think about the kids that are in school and what we're doing with the kids who are coming back to school over this period of time, as well as all of those children that aren't actually physically in the school building. We all know they're still on educational roll, and their well-being needs are as much of a priority to us as they are to the kids that are in the school. And there's been some fabulous examples of work that schools have done to really connect with and really to think about linking back into Mary's point about how do we prioritize kind of safety and connection and relationships. So I think it would be a mistake to only kind of ensure that any contact is around academic work. The only time I'm in touch is either to set something for you or to tell you how you got on with doing it. It's more around how have things been? What's it been like for you? What are the things that you would like to kind of contribute to the class that are in school, the class as a whole? Are there ways that kids can virtually join a classroom setting when other kids are still in class, to give them a sense of that connection, that belonging, even to kind of ask kids how they would like to input into lesson plans or well-being plans for the kids that are back into school, to kind of give them that agency to feel like they've not been forgotten, because for many of those kids, they may really want to come back to school to connect in with their mates, but their physical kind of well-being means that they're not able to. So to really make that provision, one of the things that's been really interesting for us in Gwent is that we spent quite a lot of time doing inquiry work with schools in our region about what are kids saying currently, what are the most important things for them. And time again, the things come up is about relationships. So it's, will I be with the class teacher who knows me best? Will that TA be in my class group? Will I be with my group of friends? Will I be able to be with my sibling? You know, kids time and time again are asking about my key relationships, and to really think about how we prioritize them and kind of allow that relationship to kind of continue even if they're not in the classroom seems vitally important to me.
Thank you, and that leads very nicely actually to another comment that someone's made, that they appreciate what you're saying about supporting staff after lockdown, but children need consistency. How do we make sure that children are foremost in staff's thoughts and approach?
You know, I think the issue on supporting staff is important, because I think it's impossible for us to think deeply about other people's needs and other people's situations when we are consumed by strong feelings and anxiety about our own needs and our own situations. So I think the beginning point of that actually is ensuring that members of staff are well supported and do feel like someone's got their back, really, and that staff as well are confident in the plans that the leadership of the school have made with regards to social distancing and all the things that people might be getting anxious about. So I think that's why it's in order for staff to ensure that children are foremost in their thoughts, getting their own anxiety and stress out of their thoughts is probably the first step to that, I would think, really.
Okay.
I don't know if anybody else has got anything else to add.
It feels like, oh, sorry, Mary, go on.
I was just going to mention the very real phenomenon, which is emotional contagion. You know, and if staff don't look after their own well-being, there's no way that they can look after children in their care, because you know it spreads. There was some research that showed that teachers who reported high level of burnout, the level of cortisol in the classroom taken from saliva samples from the kids as they walked in was actually way higher. So it really does spread. So the first thing we have to do is look after the staff, and so they can spread, you know, their calm and their reassurance and their happiness to be back, and not their own anxieties, because they do spread like wildfire, because we're social beings. We pick up on each other's cues, and particularly vulnerable children are so highly tuned into all of that for survival reasons, that we have to be very mindful of our whole demeanour. Gemma touched on that earlier, talking about facial expressions and so on.
Yeah, I think it links, Mary, to your previous point about courageous leadership. So I think what we're asking schools to do is take a real leap of faith, you know, in the context where, you know, targets are looming and academic achievement is looming and catching up is looming. What we're inviting schools to think about is taking that leap of faith and having real courage to say, I'm going to place well-being front and centre, because actually I can really sign up to the fact that unless we do this, all of those other things that we want to be able to achieve around prioritising children's needs, helping kids to learn, we have to be courageous enough to say, do you know what? This is where the work is first, in order that all of those other things will inevitably fall out of it. But we can't be just doing well-being as a token effort because we want to get to the bit where kids start learning again. You know, it's really about how do we embrace this and do this with authenticity.
And I think the consistency point is very important. I know you need to move on, Claire, but the consistency point is very important. Children do need consistency, and I think this is why we're saying the things we're saying around in the bubbling. Let's plan which children are going to be in which bubbles. Let's make sure children are in a bubble with familiar members of staff and familiar support workers, and with other children and young people that they maybe already are quite reasonable friends with. So make sure that those things are sorted. And I think as well, in terms of consistency of staffing, what we don't want is teachers going off with stress and anxiety and throwing everything into the air again. And I think a courageous senior leadership team will have the teachers' backs if the teachers decide to go all out there and put children's well-being first. And that's what is needed to ensure that level of consistency, really, because when I speak to teachers, what I get in feedback is a big group of people who want to put children's needs first. So, and there is such a lot of stuff that cuts across that and gets in the way of it. And so a courageous senior leadership team cuts through that stuff and enables teachers to do what they really need to do. Claire, sorry, go on.
No, thank you. We've got a few questions that have come in around the same kind of theme. One of them is considering moving to a school that's 10 minutes away. Currently her children are an hour away, but is concerned about another change. And that really links into some of the other questions and comments that we're getting around the going back, especially if they're going back into another year group, another school, if they've not had time to do any of the transitions that would normally be happening now, and the fear around that. So some of them may be going back to the same school, but in a different part of the building with teachers that they don't know, there's classes that have been split, or maybe moving on to a completely new setting.
Oh, yes, when I originally did this similar webinar for parents, we had a whole slide on transitioning to a new setting because it's such an enormous sort of area. And I think I would really like to see schools everywhere working out ways where they can put in enhanced transition programs, even if some of that has to be done virtually. So some of it is the same kind of things we've already said: videos, photographs. Do you know, a video of the teachers, because I know that for safeguarding reasons, some schools are not engaging in live Zoom or live chat or that kind of thing. There's all kinds of different approaches that schools and settings are able to take. But even so, a 3-minute video recorded by the teacher or the key worker or whichever is the key member of staff, just introducing themselves to children, saying that they're looking forward to welcoming them, saying a little bit about themselves and the setting. All of this is incredibly important. So all the things that would have been done in person, if they can't be done in person, they need to start to be done in a virtual kind of way. And I think for children who will particularly struggle with transition, key members of staff need to contact the family in advance. Virtual tour of the new setting. If possible, socially distanced tours arranged for small groups of children who are going to find this particularly difficult. Schools can work together to identify children who would most benefit from that. I think for parents and carers to think about is, do you know anybody, or does your child know anybody who already goes to the new school or the new setting? So does your child know anybody who's already at that nursery or already at that school? Is it possible to set up some kind of conversation between the two families to talk about what it's like and what the child enjoys and finds fun about going there? And I think as well, there's a lot that there will be a lot that is changed, but there will be a lot that is exactly the same. You will still need to travel to the place. You will still put your clothes on in the morning. You will still pack your bag and put your school lunch or whatever. There are routines around going to nursery or school that will be in place, and these can be introduced and practiced in advance in the same way that you would do anyway. And I think to acknowledge and to talk through children's worries and fears, because telling children it'll be fine if they don't think it's going to be fine, that doesn't calm their anxieties. It makes their anxieties worse, actually. So I think some of those are some of the quite practical things they could be doing. But also, we said earlier about breaking things down into small steps. I think in terms of transitioning, we might need to be aware that children started a new setting or going into a new class. We might need to revisit strategies that we would normally consider for much younger children. And we might also need to be aware that some children will have returned to coping strategies that served them well when they were younger. And so maybe presenting themselves in a way that is not what you'd expect for a child of that chronological age. So I think at all stages of transition, settings are going to need to be aware that some of the children that will be coming will be experiencing challenges that you might not normally expect from a child of that age, if you know what I mean, and to adjust the provision that you're making accordingly. I don't know if anyone else wants to pop in.
Sorry, I was just going to say, it's quite interesting what somebody's just said. What they think they're going to do from September is have the same class going in, so they will have an ending for a few days the first week of September and then move on, which if schools are able to facilitate that, that's obviously a good way of helping.
Yeah.
I think just to pick up on a couple of points that you made, Becky, I wonder whether there's some really creative opportunities, particularly for kind of older kids, maybe making the transition to comp, about how they can include kids that are already in the comp about how they would describe the school. What are the things that they can enjoy about the school? What's the best thing about the school lunch? You know, kids maybe who are already back in school being able to do video tours for kids to see that are kind of done by young people for young people. The other thing I wonder about is just kind of identifying those kids that we know as school communities will really struggle with transitions, and how important it is both to do that work behind the scenes of kind of handing over, doing a good handover about these are the kinds of things that's really important to know about this child, but the value in actually making that explicit as well. So, you know, the class teacher who knows the child, who is the safe base, having a chat with that child about, what do we need to let that new teacher know? These are the things that I know and have learnt about you over the last years. These are the things that I really enjoy about you. These are the things that we've done together. These are the times when I think you struggle. What do you reckon? What's most important for us to kind of let your new teacher know? And I wonder whether for the most kind of vulnerable kids, actually the child being able to witness in some way that passing over of information, because kids need to know explicitly that the person who knows me best is handing over all of that information, so I don't have to do all of that work myself. So that whether that's about a shared video conversation, or if a child finds that difficult to engage in that themselves, maybe a parent could have that conversation with their child. What do we need to let your new teacher know? What do you love? What do you find difficult? How will they know what your body looks like when you're feeling stressed? And that maybe the kid can just listen and the parent can kind of do that talking for the child. But again, it's about creating networks of communities around kids that say, we've got you, we're interested in you, we care about you, and we're keeping you safe.
The person that was asking, one of the people that was asking this was really asking about early years. Now, I think it's a particular difficulty with children starting nursery and early year settings for the first time. I'm in no way an early years specialist, so I wish I could give better advice on this. But I think the particular issue that I see being raised is, and certainly I'm speaking to a member of a staff at an early year setting that I know, and they're trying to work out how they're going to transition children into the setting when the parents are not allowed to come into the setting. So this is one of the things around early years, that the handover will need to be at the door, and whereas normally she'd be completely happy for parents to come in and sit in for as long as they want and have a really long transition, but they won't be able to have under the social distancing guidance, parents coming in and out of the building and parents sort of mixing with the bubbles of children. I think that's going to be particularly challenging. Honestly, I part of me is like, how can you overcome that? But I think there is maybe scope in sort of bringing transition objects from home, if that's acceptable. And I know there will be restrictions on that in terms of what can be kept clean and that kind of thing. But transition objects from home, the child having a photograph of the parent with them. Some parents I know that might draw draw a little picture, a heart or something on their hand, and then draw the same heart on the child's hand and say, this we've got the same heart now and this connects us, and even though I'm leaving you now, I'm going to bring you my heart later. Those kinds of things. But actually it is, when I said earlier that a smooth return might be optimistic, this is one of the areas where I think is going to be particularly challenging.
Perfumes and smells as well are quite important, I think, for younger kids. I do think, Becky, it is really important for us also to acknowledge, as you say, it will be challenging, and also to say, actually, we feel like there are some real risks around being able to support a child who's got early trauma in this way, in this transition. So, you know, is it about being more creative? Setting up a time outside of school time where someone can be in that classroom to allow that parent to come in with that child to just spend a little bit of time in that setting playing. So, you know, that we're not kind of, I feel like sometimes the kind of COVID rules mean that everything is locked down, but we also have to acknowledge that there will be significant risks to children's emotional well-being, particularly those who've experienced trauma, and we really need to be creative about which risk are we prioritising.
Someone in the chat that maybe early year settings could have the first activity of the day be an outdoor activity, so that parents can sort of be in that outdoor space. That's a great idea. Sorry, Claire.
No, I was just going to read the same, thank you. And personally, we're on the other extreme of this, that my son is leaving year 11 and going into college. So that's a huge change that we're trying to work through at the moment. So it's extremes, isn't it, of trying to help as much as we can. Thank you. I think we have gone through all of the questions. So unless anybody's got any other questions that they want to
I'm going to briefly share screen, Claire, just while you're saying this last bit, because I have found the book I was talking about earlier.
And the link for the wellbeing plan we will get sent out tomorrow with the link to this recording, so they will both go out together. So you've got a copy of the recording to pass around and the links. So
here we are. There's a back to school story. That's a general. It's not a social story. It's a story, but it's a general thing aimed at young children to try and help them understand what will be happening. The book I was talking about is called While We Can't Hug. I've only seen a video version of it. I think they're going to release it as an actual book, but someone's made a beautiful animation of it, and it's absolutely beautiful for younger children. Actually, for grown-ups like me, it was absolutely delightful, really nice. And I'll also mention, I think, this from the British Psychological Society. They've produced a piece of guidance supporting care experienced children and young people. That's aimed at professionals, it's aimed at education professionals, so that is well worth a read if you're a teacher at any level, in any setting. That's definitely worth having a look at. I'm not sure if I had any more. Not so much that one,
we've put together a 50-minute video from the psychologist in the South East Wales Adoption Service about return to school, so I can forward you on the link if you want to share that with people. They're more than welcome to have that.
That's lovely, thanks Gemma. And what we will do is we'll get all of these resources and all of the links pulled together, and they will go out tomorrow with a link to the recording to be shared, so it's all in one place for you. So thank you so much for joining us. It was fantastic to see so many schools online today, because we know that it's not easy to get away from the classroom a lot of the time. So thank you, and a huge thank you to Gemma, Mary and to Becky for doing the webinar. It's such an important topic at the moment, and if we can try and all work together to get this right. So I really appreciate your time that you've given us, so thank you very much.